It's all of the folks that make this possible. And I'm always grateful when there's companies that will, not pony up, but actually be generous and sponsor these kind of events. My name is Jeffrey Miller. I'm a consultant in the Columbus area, Columbus, Ohio. I work for an information control company. I'm also co-founder of a humanitarian open source project called WorldVax, worldvax.org. And this project basically aims to increase vaccination rates in developing countries. And the way that we do that is we take the software where it normally can't go, and that's mobile, Raspberry Pi, this kind of thing. So I'll mention that at the end as well. What we're here to talk about today is tribal knowledge. Has anybody heard that term, tribal knowledge? All right, well, that's probably why you're in the room. Okay. Now, tribal knowledge is typically stuff that's not written down, right? So this is my only slide in the presentation. This presentation intentionally left blank. I'm just going to talk about tribal knowledge and make sure you don't take any notes, and then you'll just try to do it from memory when you get back to your office and tell your friends what you heard, and then they can tell their friends what they heard, right? And that's it, right? That's the problem with tribal knowledge. So I'm actually lying. There are more slides in the deck. So. But I want you to imagine something that I've gone through even this week. Is you're on a development project, or you're on any kind of project. Maybe you're new to the team that you're on, and you think you're doing it right. You're like getting in there, you're learning the environment. You're like, all right, I've got my code ready, or I've got my docs ready, or whatever. And you send that initial email. You say, all right, I'm good to go. Put in a request, and then about 15 minutes later, somebody walks by your desk and they're like, yeah, that thing that you did, we don't usually do it that way, which basically translates into this. You're doing it wrong, right? You don't know what they know. You don't know how they do it because you're not one of they, you're one of just you, right? So you get this kind of, it's like a fight or flight response, right? Maybe you're feeling some embarrassment and you're like, oh, sorry, my bad. Or maybe you're like, dang it, this always happens to me. Or maybe you're even angry, right? You're like, I hate this place, right? So what I want you to think about, you're like, sorry, what else can you say? You're like, I'm sorry. But, so other than the sad face and the surprised look, we heard in the keynote that, everybody's got this internal gut-wrenching response on things. So you should just stop and realize that it's not your fault. All right, everybody turn to their neighbor if you got one and say to them, it's not your fault. Go ahead. It's not your fault, right? It's just human nature. It's just human nature that there's insiders and outsiders in different situations, and there's insiders and outsiders in any kind of groups. You've got, in a development shop, you've got the devs and the QA folks, and then even within those groups, there's like a few people that might make all the decisions, and they know what's going on, but they forgot to tell you. But it's really not your fault. Tribal knowledge, according to Wikipedia, is information that is known within a tribe, and that's a kind of an interesting term, but unknown outside. So a tribe is just any group of people that share something in common. It's not an indigenous people like you might classically think of it. It's a group of people that are maybe in a similar situation, or they have something in common. So anybody ever drive a U-Haul?
Yes.
Anybody like driving a U-Haul? Okay, well, I recently drove a U-Haul, and this is not a story about U-Hauls in general. It's actually the tale of the tow haul mode. Anybody know what tow haul mode is? Good. Because you're going to learn about it from me. Because I learned the hard way, okay? So tow haul mode. Well, 2014, I had just gotten married to my wife, Brandy, and I lived near Columbus, she lived near Detroit, and we had to move her stuff down. She owned a house, and we were moving into our shared house. And seemed like the only solution I could come up with was let's rent a U-Haul and get all this stuff down here. So we basically, they upgraded us from a 10-foot to a 14-foot truck. I was like, hey, bonus, right? Because they didn't have the 10-foot. And it's got the mom's attic. You've probably seen that little cubby up there. And so the guy just ran through the whole process. He's like, all right, here's how much fuel you have in the truck, and make sure when you bring it back, it's got that same amount of fuel. And, you know, here's how you open the door, just don't pinch your fingers, those kind of things. And this is the first time I've ever driven a U-Haul. And I've got some advice for you. If you see a U-Haul on the road, take a wide berth, because if they're like me, they're dangerous, okay? It's not a fun experience. So, you know, I wouldn't call myself any kind of expert at driving any kind of truck, really. I drive a sedan. I barely fit into the Honda Accord that I drive. But so you got these big mirrors, and so I'm pulling out into traffic, and this thing is just dog slow. You know, it's not getting up very, very high and very fast. I'm thinking, man, this thing is just it's a bulky truck. So, long story short, the trip is about 250 miles round trip, and it's driving down the highway, and, you know, I-75. It's just like, okay, go around me, you know. You're just the slowest guy on the highway. And we took the truck back, and about 5 miles, you know, it's got this tow haul mode light on there. It says, you know, it's got the fuel gauge. It says how efficiently you're driving. Every time you let off the gas and you coast it, you get the 4 or 5 green bars, like, hey, you're saving the environment, right? Well, I was getting 1 bar the whole time, and 8.9 miles to the gallon. Gas was at about 370 at the time. I filled up the tank at least once, or maybe once and a half, and found out it's a 40-gallon tank, so do the math, right? So about 5 miles from the drop-off location, I look over on the dash, and I see this little button that says tow haul mode. I'm like, wait a minute, what does that do? I'm thinking the tow haul light's on, I'm hauling a bunch of crap, right? I need that. So I hit the button, and all of a sudden that truck starts responding like you wouldn't believe. It gets up to speed. It's like, what? I mean, I've been driving this thing 250 miles, and all of a sudden I hit that little button, and it's a different experience. So I was trying to see if I had maybe missed the memo on what tow haul mode is. The guy didn't tell me. I looked over the paper. It wasn't on there. I even searched on U-Haul's website. Now, if you search for tow and haul on uhaul.com, you're not going to get great results, right? So what I did is I put it in quotes, you know, tow/haul. What I found was not instructions about it. All I found was user reviews saying, good service, truck worked okay, although the light for tow haul was on the entire time. Okay? The next person said, you might need clearer instruction on the how and why of the tow haul indicator light that pops on as a default, greatly increases gas consumption if you're not hauling a trailer or pulling a car. So that's what it's for. The next guy said the staff was friendly. I wish the tow haul feature would have been explained from the beginning. Right? But here's the great one. It says, I got into the truck and started it. The tow haul light was on. I called the office before I left the parking lot to say, what's this light for? And the man in the office explained it to me without making me feel stupid. And they got a 4 out of 5 stars, so that's not too bad, right? Now, that's what we're talking about when we talk about tribal knowledge, right? It's that detail that some of them know. I bet you if you asked any of the guys in the office, they say, oh yeah, tow haul mode, I know exactly what that is, but they didn't tell you up front. And so this is a great example. Unfortunately, it took me 2 search result pages to find this one where they got it right. So one of the big things that you can do with tribal knowledge being that information that's kind of coveted but not really valued, right? You don't think, oh, I got tribal knowledge. Improve your onboarding. Now, I worked at a client a couple years ago, and we had someone join the team that was on a different team, a developer, and we had a project in full swing, and we had 12 developers already, and this guy joined the team. They handed him a feature. They said, okay, build this feature. And so he worked like 2 or 3 months on this feature, and all of a sudden, the tech lead comes in and looks at the code, and what do you know? He's doing it wrong, right? And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. That's not his fault. That's your fault. That's the fault of the team and the process that we didn't give this person what they needed to succeed from the beginning. So, some things that you can do to improve your onboarding is, whether you're the new person or not, always think like the new person. Think about what they would need to succeed. Think about the information that they're not going to know right off the bat that you're going to need to give them. Think about their perspective. They're going to be frustrated, or they're going to be challenged, and you want them to succeed early. They're already having that imposter syndrome that we heard about upstairs, right? They're like, I don't even belong here. And then you throw this in their path, and they're like, man, I really don't belong here. So now that goes both ways. If you are the new person, see this as an opportunity. Even if you can't, get through your current task or your current challenge right away, think about how this can be better the next time for the new person when they come. One thing that I like to suggest is that you work on a product together. So when you onboard a person, don't just onboard them and say, okay, here's the buttons you press. Actually create a work product together that captures that, right? Let's write the docs together. So when we onboard that person, we've got an artifact that we can then give to the next person. Create a record. That's basically what I'm saying, is that you record that experience. And I've even set up a video camera, that one right there. I did it a client a few years ago. We did a knowledge transfer session. We had a 4-year project, and we're handing the system over to some state employees to maintain. And we had a staff of like 15, and we're handing it over to 2 people. And I know how this goes. The person moves on. They say, hey, I'm getting a promotion in a different state agency. We actually had one of the people that we transferred the knowledge to. They moved back to India to take care of their parents. And it's like, well, what are you going to do? So what I decided to do, Alistair Coburn, one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, says, Agile gets a rap for not having a lot of documentation. They say, oh, we don't need documentation, we just have the code. Well, he says that sometimes the best form of documentation is to get 2 engineers in front of a whiteboard and talk about it, whiteboard it for an hour in front of a video camera, rather than writing this big Word doc, right? So that's what we did. We got 30 hours of video, 30 different hour-long sessions, and both of those people are now gone. And they still have the videos that they can use, and they're still using them, so that worked out great. Now, part of the problem with tribal knowledge is that stuff in your head that's always, it's coming in hot, and then it's leaving out your ears when you go home, right? It's kind of transient. So, that could come in the form of email. That could come in the form of just conversations, hallway conversations. Hey, we're going to deploy it to the server now in a certain way. Make sure you handle it a certain way. And that might be 3 people that are having that conversation. And your team is 10 people, or 12 or 20. And it's like, well, yeah, we'll tell them eventually, right? Or we'll send an email. So what you want to do is transform that dynamic and transient information into resources that you can use. Now, email, I'm terrible at email. I know a lot of people will hey, as soon as they get an email pop up, they'll respond to it. I might get back to you in about 3 days or something if I'm on my game. But if you think about the information that comes in email, a lot of this communication will, it will be communicated, but it's through forms that are just this blast, and it's not really captured. And I know when I first got to the client that I'm at now, I said, hey, how do I connect to the database? How do I connect to this and that? And what did they do? They said, oh, well, I've got some emails that I'll forward to you, right? So it's like I got 5, 6, 10 emails, and I basically just kind of said, okay, this has raw data, that's great. You've got cluttered inboxes, you've got retention limits. Like some companies will actually purge email even as soon as 90 days, for privacy and security concerns. I had emails going back 4 years on that first project that were foundational and had core information about the way that the project should work. And the accounting department there, once they instituted this retention policy, they lost emails that had software license keys that were really important. It's like, yeah, you might not want to do that. So, and then if somebody leaves, what's the first thing they deactivate when you leave? They turn off your email box, right? So if you're the keeper of that information, it's gone. Now, I do use some strategies with email that make it work for me. The first is I create categories that represent knowledge base and onboarding. So right off the bat, when I get to a client, I create those 2 categories. What that allows me to do is identify things that were useful to me that I can then share with other people. Now, not everything fits into both categories. Usually, if it's onboarding, I'll put them in both. But especially the things that a new person would need, I put that category in. And then I have quick steps that will file it where it needs to go. That's an Outlook feature. If you've never seen that, it's really useful. You can assign a hotkey in certain actions. And then search folders. Search folders are great because you can set up a filter for these criteria, for example, and you can find it very quickly. So about a month after I started my current client, we had another person join, and what we did was we sat down for half an hour to an hour, and I just pulled up my category and said, hey, let's walk through all the things that I've gleaned that you're going to need to know. And the way that works is you've got some favorites. You can see up here in your inbox. I also add search folders to capture those categories, and then the knowledge base one is a long-running one, and then the onboarding one is one that a new person would need. So I've got those right in my Outlook, ready to go. But we didn't stop there. We actually converted it to OneNote. If you've ever used OneNote, it's not a bad program. It's gotten a lot better over time, and now it has great Office integration. So another thing that we do is we automate common responses and infrequent responses. Sometimes you've got a request that you do once every 6 months, or maybe it's one that you do every week. But either way, you can benefit from some templates and some boilerplate stuff that you create and have sitting around. And every time you do that, that's something that you can give to somebody else that they can use. Michael Hyatt, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a very popular blogger, podcaster. One of the things that he recommends is that you can use your Outlook email signatures for not just your name and phone number, you can use it for a large portion of the body text. And when he gets certain requests, he'll put a little personalized bit at the top and go to his signatures and pull up the canned, here's how to do X, Y, Z, the question that he gets all the time. Outlook has a wonderful button and it's called Send to OneNote, and it basically can convert an email into something that's shared. And we're using this a lot on my current project, and I've come to like it, even though it's different than, say, a wiki. I like wikis. The thing is, you can't just drop everything and say, okay, everybody turn in their tribal knowledge, we're going to capture it all right now. It just doesn't work that way. So what you want to do is be practical. Now, that can come in the form of, when something goes wrong, you say, oh, dang it, I hate it when this happens. Well, that's an opportunity to capture things about that situation to make sure it doesn't happen again and that we all learn from it. Now, you shouldn't just focus on the what and the how. That's what we usually, it's step 1, step 2. Sometimes it's helpful to add who and why. Okay, who is important because you might be in a department where you've just joined, and the person that worked on a certain part of the system may be right in the next queue, or they might be in another department because they've been promoted, moved on, transferred. Sometimes it's critical to know who to talk to. I mean, it's especially critical because all that stuff that's still in their head, you know, you need access to that. I was at a client where we had this one hour session. It was called the application portfolio, and they basically said, okay, here's all of our systems. Here's how they feed together. And I thought, you know what? That is great. That is awesome. I've never seen that done before. But let's put that next to the org chart and say, okay, System X, all right, who are the people that work on that, right? Because I want to know who I can talk to about that system when I work on it. The why and the why not. You know, understanding the why behind the decisions is a crucial piece of information and rarely ends up in documentation. But also the why not. Back in the 1950s, there was a project, I think it's called Atoms for Peace. Basically, they were looking at an alternative to uranium for nuclear power, and that was called, thorium is the substance. And thorium was decided against because it didn't have weapons potential, right? We want uranium because it can do power and blow things up, right? Yay. So around 2000, a guy at NASA discovered this manual about this other research, and they basically decided against thorium, but nobody really talked about why. And yet there was this manual just sitting with dust on it that said, hey, here's this other alternative. It's cheaper to produce, it's safer, and oddly, you know, it's radioactive for only a few hundred years instead of tens of thousands of years. I thought, oh, great, that's a savings. But sometimes when you're making decisions, it's valuable to capture why you didn't choose the alternative. So that's another big thing to think about. Now, when we do work, you know, we're trained experts. You know, we come in with some experience, and you know, we seem to know what we're doing, but mistakes happen all the time. You know, especially when you talk about complex teams and systems. And something that can help with that is checklists. I read a book called The Checklist Manifesto. Atul Gawande. Has anybody ever read that book? Okay, a couple. Great. It talks about, he's a doctor, and he wanted to improve surgical results. So he was exploring all of these ways to do that, and what he stumbled across was the checklists in aviation and different industries that they just totally rely on. One of the first big planes mid-century, last century, that they were producing, it was supposed to be this great, you know, awesome machine. It's going to, you know, be a great tool for the military. And they went to demo it, and the first thing that happened was a few seconds after takeoff, their best pilot and crew crashed and burned and died. It's like, what went wrong, right? Well, what they decided to do was to put together a checklist to avoid these common errors. It was something to do with the flaps or something. It just wasn't so many moving parts. But aviation has gotten really good at having checklists. If you've heard of the recent landing of the airplane in the river, you know, Sully, I think, was the captain of that. It was a textbook landing. They've got these checklists that they go by. What they came up with was a global recommendation for a checklist, and this is what that looks like. It's the surgical safety checklist. They wanted to improve surgical outcomes and all the common errors that are produced. They basically came up with 3 columns. We have the sign-in, where everyone identifies themselves. Hey, I'm the anesthesiologist, I'm a nurse, I'm a doctor, I'll be doing this and that. And then there's a timeout where they, before they make the cuts, they go through this checklist, and then after the patient is operating on and they are ready to send them out, they say, okay, we have all this and that. And there was a lot of resistance at first, because doctors are like, hey, I'm a doctor. I've studied medical school for over 10 years. I know what I'm doing. Leave me alone. But they did start seeing some really good results. Effective checklists have a certain number of commonalities. There's a checklist for checklists on projectchecklist.org, so remember that. And it's by the same author in that same effort. And it's largely medical checklists, and they're trying to collect those. The World Health Organization checklist for surgery is on there, but there are many others. But this checklist for checklists talk about how to make an effective one. You should stick to one page, is one of the recommendations. If you can imagine someone in surgery trying to go like this and flip through all kinds of pages while they're doing the procedure. It's just not practical. And it recommends using natural pause points to do those checks. So don't interrupt normal processes if you can help it, but you want to use those natural pauses to check. Even formatting can make a difference. You want dark text on a light background, and they're not a tutorial. You're dealing with trained people, and it's not a step-by-step where it says, okay, click this button, or cut here. It's basically a reminder system. And then the point of it is to protect it against mistakes, because you don't want to, with all the great things that we can do with our skills, why screw that up? One of the ways to capture tribal knowledge is to create reusable tools that just kind of take the place of the documentation. We have Agile where it's code is the documentation of the system. My big frustration currently is the setup on my machine. It's been a year since I've been on my client, and I still can't get the whole app to run because there's all these build problems, and I'm amazed that they deploy it successfully every month. I mean, no offense, but I'm like, well, why can't we get my machine working as well as that goes? So, templates. Anybody use templates? Like personally, like frequently? Yeah, awesome. Documents and code snippets are common ways, but honestly, I've not seen that many development teams that have shared templates for code. Visual Studio and SQL Management Studio, SQL Server Management Studio, they have these built-in clipboard managers and code snippets, but I've used them a few times. Who does that? Common emails, as we said, but you've also got common keystrokes. I use a tool. It's called, this is an email. I created this tool because of these requests, and I can make this code available. It's out there. It's an email generator for common requests, and you see the little drop down. Basically, these are samples, but I've got about a dozen that I create commonly. Database requests, code deployment requests, even for onboarding, I've got, hey, let's give person X access to a shared mailbox that we use. Now, you basically fill in your details. You've got some special fields depending on what the request is. And once that's filled out, it gives you a preview. So it's filling out these things. And then at the very bottom, it's populating a mail to link. Now, the great thing about mail to links is you can throw parameters in there with subject and body and CC. And basically what that does when you click on it is it pops open in your default email client your email with it pre-populated. So it's like, the great thing about that, you can see all those things that were entered on the previous page. I can copy that link and put it anywhere. I can drag it to my toolbar. I can put it in a OneNote, so this other person doesn't have to have that tool. They just click the link, and it's a mail to link, right? So, keystrokes. If you've got things like text replacement, I use a lot of common ones. When I'm signing emails or when I'm writing my name, we can have some pretty cool text replacements. For example, when I've got underscore PKQ, which basically just says, please let me know if you have any questions. How many times have you written that, right? Or if I want to say thanks, I just put underscore TX and it just says thanks. Or if I want to write my name, then I just put underscore JM and it puts Jeff Miller. It's just these little savings, and it does more than that. Like if I want to put thanks in advance, I just put TAJ and it does the whole block, right? So that saves me a lot of time, and it's something that I can share with others. I mean, not everybody wants to sign their emails Jeff Miller, but the rest of them they can use. So wikis. Anybody use a wiki in your current assignment or situation? Awesome. I love wikis. Wiki is Hawaiian for quit, I guess. The reason I like wikis is because it's very open in sharing. By default, it's participation is welcome. Information is more discoverable because it's linked together. You can't really create a page without creating a link to that page. And then you can add content easily, you can update it easily, and then the last part is that intent is expressed before action. You can put a link to a page that doesn't exist, And if you try to navigate to that page and it doesn't exist, it'll say, hey, would you like to create it? Please. And so what that allows you to do is to put implicit votes for content. Say, hey, here's some most wanted topics that we need. We need the developer setup. We need the release management checklist, those kind of things. If you have never heard of it, Wikimatrix is a really good site. It has probably too much information, but if there's a couple wikis that you've heard of or there's specific features that you're looking for, you can compare them, and you can basically side by side all of the features that they have, whether they're stored in databases or as files, and what kind of security. Another way to capture tribal knowledge is to kind of put yourself out there. Be a champion for it, or an advocate. You can blog about it and build up an audience for the material. Now, certainly you don't want to use secret sauce kind of stuff on your blog, but if there's something that's pretty generic that you can put out there, it's a good way to document it. Examples on GitHub, open source. If you want to answer questions on Stack Overflow, there's already a demonstrated need because somebody's raising their hand saying, I have a question, right? So you know that your contribution is actually useful. And then social media, not just Twitter, but internally we have a Yammer site that basically lets us internally communicate with each other and share things. Now, use what you have at your client or your employer, and that even includes SharePoint. So, anybody like SharePoint? I don't know. Don't raise your hand if you're embarrassed. Now, I used to say SharePoint is where information goes to die, right? It just goes out there and collects dust. Now, I've recently changed that to calling it Shareberia, where information goes to starve and then die. So, I'm just kidding mostly, but we can make it work for us. The problem is if you let it languish, it's just a digital dustbin. That could be the same with a file share. It doesn't matter that it's SharePoint. But, if you've got stuff out there, it's kind of an archaeological exercise. And you can go ahead and dig around. And I actually challenged our SharePoint administrator, the previous client, to basically sponsor a scavenger hunt where you go through SharePoint and you're like, wow, that was a really good document back in the day. That was really relevant and poignant. And dig those up and share them and then maybe update them, right? One thing about SharePoint is it does have a wiki feature. It's not great, but it does let you browse and link to existing documents in SharePoint. So if you got a SharePoint wiki, you can link to the good stuff that's sitting in there collecting dust, and that makes it more relevant. There's also a tags and notes feature. So if you find SharePoint content, you can tag it so it's more discoverable, and it's related to the audience that matters for. Now, all of this requires intentionality. You basically have to start with an intentional mindset. And that takes planning, and it's not just looking for what can I put out there. Sometimes it's just listening to find out what the needs are. And, kind of plan ahead. If you've ever, for knowledge transfer, if you've ever had somebody turn in a 2 weeks notice, their manager panics and they say, oh, we need to do knowledge transfer, did with so-and-so. And so they schedule a 1 or 2 hour meeting. It's like, okay, unless you're Spock and can do the, Vulcan mind meld, you're not going to transfer what you know to that person in that 2 hour meeting. You're not even going to, if all you did was document it in a word processor, you're not going to even remember everything that you know. So you really want to be planning persistently and constantly for what kind of things a new person would need, even cross-training. Some of the frustration that I'm experiencing now is that, I'm on a new thing that my manager kind of switched me over to. So I'm coming into the tribe, and it's foreign. But the good thing about that, the opportunity that's in that, is that I'm another person now that is getting experience on that thing. So I get to learn this, right? So I have to learn this. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's a tall order. All this stuff is, it's really hard. And you're probably saying, but, we don't have the time. We can't drop everything. We got too much going on to sit there and write documents. You can use what you have. Start with email and then convert it later. Or we don't communicate. Maybe you got a team that's dysfunctional and it's not great, but, work around that. find ways to, go against that trend. And then people don't share. Sometimes you get a person that's pigeonholed in a job, they've been doing it forever, but they're kind of, it's like this, I don't know if it's codependency or what it is. It's like this self-fulfilling cycle where, they hate their job, but they don't want to give it to anybody else. Have you heard of golden handcuffs, anybody? Golden handcuffs is where a person knows something that's so specialized that their company keeps paying them more and more to keep them around, but then they can't go anywhere else and make the same money, so they're stuck. So sometimes people don't share, but that's just something you have to deal with. So I reference this scripture from Ecclesiastes. It basically is King Solomon moaning and groaning about the futility of life in the early chapters. And it says, "Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will rule over all my labor. This also is vanity." Right? It's like, what's the point? All this stuff that I'm doing for the next guy, is it even going to matter, right? Well, I like to have a different viewpoint. And maybe sometimes you feel like you're pushing that boulder up the hill, Sisyphus, right? This is the Lego version. And it feels kind of futile because, you push up the hill and then it just rolls down the other side, So what I like to encourage people to do is to stop making excuses and just kind of just say, I'm going to do it. I'm going to advocate for sharing this information. I'm going to do little things a bit at a time. But basically, you can be intentional. I like to be optimistic and, even courageous. This is Robert Baden-Powell. You think Powell, but it's British and doesn't make any sense. And he says, he founded the Boy Scouts, so you might recognize this sentiment. He says, try to leave this world a little better than you found it. And when it comes your turn to die, you can die happy and feeling that at any rate you have not wasted your time, but you have done your best. So, I encourage you to think a little bit that way, leave things better than you found it. And if we are intentional, we're optimistic and courageous, we'll all be a lot better off. Thank you. This is my contact information. I'm on Twitter at Zagronaut. It's a really weird spelling, but I made sure it was globally unique. That was a good benefit. But it's also very obscure, so I don't know, take your pick. I'm on LinkedIn. As I mentioned, the World Vax Project initiative. We're not a nonprofit at this point. We're hoping to get some traction. We're still looking for some medical experts that are giving aid in foreign countries to see if they can vet our application. So I'd love to talk to any of you about it afterwards. Question?
I was just going to make a comment.
Yes.
I found that a program that we downloaded from Git called Fabricator is very, very useful in sharing information. We use it sort of as a tracking system.
Yeah.
You can use it for help tickets. You can use for tracking projects, like a project management system, but it's great for a wiki because you can use it to store knowledge. I just thought I'd throw that out there.
That's Fabricator on GitHub?
It's Fabricator, but everything is spelled with, every F sound is spelled with a PH.
Okay.
So they have friction, which is PHRIC.
Okay.
It's
Written in PHP or something?
I think it's built by the Twitter people, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so Fabricator with a PH.
PH. Okay, I will look that up for sure. That email generator that I showed you, I plan to post that on my blog. So if you follow my Twitter account at Zagronaut, that's Xagronaut, I'm thinking about how to spell it. Long story of the name, but I'll have my slides out there too. So if you want any of those, just see me after and I'll let you know. Thanks.